The morning Lavinia Wainwright's father collapsed in the east field. She had already been awake for 3 hours, mending a fence line that stretched longer than any single pair of hands could reasonably maintain. And it was in that precise moment, watching him crumple to the sun-baked Kansas earth in the summer of 1878, that she understood with terrible clarity just how alone they had always been. Her father, Theodore Wainwright, was not an old man. He was 52, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of stubbornness in his jaw that made neighbors in Caldwell say he could outwork any two men half his age. But the land had a way of making its debts known, and Theodore's debt was apparently coming due. The doctor who rode out from town 3 days later told Lavinia what she had already suspected. Theodore's heart was wearing thin. He needed rest, not the kind of rest a farmer could afford, but real rest, the kind that meant handing the reins to someone else. There was no one to hand anything to. There was only Lavinia. She was 24 years old, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of the Kansas sky on a clear October morning. That particular shade of blue that carried both warmth and the faint suggestion of coming cold. She had grown up reading every book she could get her hands on, borrowing volumes from the lending shelf at the general store, and she had a habit of thinking through problems with a thoroughness that often surprised men who expected her to simply defer. She had been quietly capable her entire life, and quietly lonely for almost as long, because a life spent managing the needs of a struggling farm left very little room for anything that looked like ordinary girlhood. The Wainwright farm sat 7 miles south of Caldwell, which in 1878 was a cattle town that had seen its share of trail drives coming up from Texas along the Kishom Trail. It was not a gentle place. It was a place where commerce and violence sat at the same table, where cowboys fresh off months of hard riding came in loud and thirsty, where the railroads were just beginning to stretch their fingers westward, and everyone was trying to figure out what shape the future was going to take. Lavinia had ridden into Caldwell hundreds of times without giving the town's roughness much thought. She had learned to move through it the way water moves through stones. But the summer Theodore collapsed, Caldwell acquired something new, a foreman. Lewis Brenner arrived in Caldwell on a Wednesday in late June, aboard a horse he called Sergeant that was the color of old copper, and moved with the deliberate confidence of an animal that had been well treated for a long time. Lewis was 30 years old, with the lean, weathered look of a man who had spent his 20s doing hard outdoor work, and had made his peace with every callous it left behind. He had sandy brown hair that the sun had touched with gold, a jaw dark with a few days' growth, and hands that told the story of his life more clearly than any introduction could. Large-knuckled, scarred in one or two interesting places, but careful in the way they handled things. He was not a man who broke what he touched. He had come from Colorado, originally, though he had worked cattle drives through Texas, spent a season with a ranch in New Mexico, and done a short, unremarkable stint as a deputy in a town called Haskell that had dried up and blown away like so much prairie dust. He was the sort of man who moved when a place had given him everything it had to give, and he had arrived in Caldwell because a rancher named Elias Dodd had sent him a letter asking if he wanted to manage the day-to-day operations of a spread that was growing faster than Dodd could keep up with. Lewis had said yes, packed what he owned into 2 saddlebags, and ridden east. He met Lavinia Wainwright for the first time on a Thursday morning, which was the day she came into Caldwell to speak with the feed merchant about extending credit. She was standing outside the feed store in the slanted morning light, holding a piece of paper on which she had written a column of numbers, and she was arguing politely but with a firmness that clearly startled the merchant, that she had always paid her accounts and would continue to pay them, and that the extension she was requesting was a business arrangement, not a favor. Lewis was leading Sergeant past the storefront on his way to the livery, and he stopped, not because of the argument, but because of a crate that had tumbled off a nearby wagon and was about to slide directly into Lavinia's path. He stepped forward and caught it before she had to step back. She turned and looked at him. He set the crate down and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. That was all. She looked at him for a moment with the measuring quality that characterized everything she did. "Thank you," she said, and then she turned back to the merchant and concluded her arrangement. Lewis went on to the livery. He did not think about her in a particular way. She had simply seemed like a woman who knew what she was doing, and that was something he noticed the way he noticed good craftsmanship in a fence or a well-shod horse, with the simple appreciation of a person who respected competence. But Caldwell was not large, and the weeks had a way of folding people together in a small town, and so their second meeting came sooner than either of them might have anticipated. It happened at the Dodd Ranch, which sat about 3 miles east of the Wainwright property. Lavinia had ridden over on a Saturday because Elias Dodd had once promised Theodore that in a hard season he would let the Wainwrights draw water from the Dodd well, since the Wainwright well had gone shallow in the drought 2 summers past, and the underground water on that side of the property had never fully recovered. Lavinia came to collect on that promise, since the creek that had been their secondary source had slowed to a trickle in the July heat. She rode up to the Dodd yard and found Lewis there, directing 2 hired hands in the business of repairing a barn door that had come off its top hinge. He was working alongside them rather than simply watching, which she noted. A lot of men with authority used it to avoid the harder parts of work. This one apparently did not. He recognized her as she dismounted. "The woman from outside the feed store," he said. "The man with the quick hands," she returned. That made him smile, which she also noted, because it changed his face considerably. There was something unguarded in that smile, something that had not been in the carefully composed expression he had worn in town. "Lewis Brenner," he said, coming forward to take her horse's bridle. "I'm managing the Dodd operation. Lavinia Wainwright. My farm is the property west of the boundary line you can see from the ridge. The one with the long fence line." She raised an eyebrow. "You have been looking." "I have been surveying the area. It's part of the job." He said it simply, without apology but also without arrogance. "Mr. Dodd is in town until this evening. Is there something I can help you with?" She explained the situation with the well and the water agreement. Lewis listened without interrupting, which was another thing she filed away without quite knowing why she was keeping a ledger on this man. When she finished, he nodded and said, "That's a reasonable agreement and I'll honor it on Mr. Dodd's behalf. You're welcome to fill what you need. I only have the 1 barrel on the wagon. We can fit 3 on there if we rig it right. The hands can help you." She started to say she could manage, which was her default response to most offers of help, but he had already turned and was calling out to the 2 hired men with the easy authority of someone who neither demanded deference nor doubted he would receive it. Within 20 minutes, 3 full barrels were loaded and secured on her wagon in a configuration she had to admit was more stable than the one she would have used. "You know rigging," she said. "Spent a year on a freight line in Colorado," he said. "You learn to balance a load or you lose your load." She gathered the reins and then hesitated, which was also unlike her. "My father is ill," she said. She did not know why she told him that. Perhaps because he had helped her without making her feel diminished by it, and that was rare enough that it loosened something in her. "I'm running the farm alone this season. I want you to know, in case you see things looking undone over there, that it's not neglect. It is simply a matter of capacity." He looked at her with those steady gray-green eyes. "I didn't take it for neglect," he said quietly. "I took it for a person doing the work of several people." She drove home with 3 barrels of water, and something she could not name sitting in her chest, small and warm and a little inconvenient. Through August, the drought deepened, and the days grew so hot that even the grasshoppers seemed disinclined to move in the early afternoon. Theodore had good days and bad days. On his good days, he sat on the porch and told Lavinia what needed doing, drawing on 52 years of farming knowledge to direct her like a general who had lost the use of his legs but not his mind. On his bad days, he slept until noon and woke pale and frightened in a way she had never seen from him before. And those were the days that pressed hardest on her because she could not let him see how frightened she was too. She managed. She managed the way she always had, by breaking the impossible thing into smaller pieces and dealing with each piece in turn. She repaired the south fence. She got the late corn in under difficult conditions. She fixed the pump housing on the shallow well using a method she had read about in an almanac and adapted with materials she had on hand. She drove the wagon into Caldwell twice a week to sell eggs and whatever produce they had going, and she smiled at the merchants and the townspeople and gave no indication that she was going to bed each night with her back aching and her mind still sorting through tomorrow's list. Lewis saw her in town on several of those trips. He began finding reasons to be near the feed store and the general store on the mornings she came in, which was something he acknowledged to himself with a kind of dry internal honesty. He was not a man who deceived himself. He recognized that he was interested in Lavinia Wainwright, and he recognized that the interest was of the kind that would not be satisfied by a brief conversation. She was the most fully present person he had encountered in a long time, present in her work, present in her worry, present in the brief moments of humor that occasionally surfaced in the way she said things. She did not perform. She was simply and entirely herself, and that quality struck him as remarkable in a world that asked women particularly to be something softer and less substantial than what Lavinia clearly was. He did not push his way into her life. That was not his manner. He simply made himself available in the ways that seemed genuinely useful, which was a distinction he cared about, because he did not want to give assistance as a means of accumulating obligation. He wanted to help because the situation seemed to call for it, and because he had the capacity to help, and because watching Lavinia carry that much weight alone produced in him a feeling he could not reduce to simple pity. It was something more complicated and more personal than pity. It was the feeling of a man who looks at a woman he admires and finds himself wanting badly to stand beside her. In September, the trouble with the cattle began. There was a man in Caldwell named Porter Hatch who ran a loose operation out of a property south of the main trail, and who had a habit of letting his cattle drift in ways that were not entirely accidental. 2 of his steers ended up in the Wainwright corn, which at that point in the season was the most precious thing on the property, since it represented the last significant cash crop before winter. The damage was not catastrophic, but it was serious, and when Lavinia rode to Porter Hatch's property to inform him of what had happened and request restitution, Hatch dismissed her with the particular brand of contempt that some men in 1878 felt entitled to deploy toward women who came to them with complaints. He told her she had probably not latched her gate properly. He told her corn damage from cattle was a common thing and not his concern. He told her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that she ought to find herself a husband to manage these things. Lavinia rode home white-faced with anger rather than humiliation, which was an important distinction, and she spent the evening writing a formal complaint that she intended to bring to the county clerk in the morning. It was the correct and lawful approach, and she knew it was also almost certainly going to be slow and possibly ineffective, because Hatch had been in the area longer than the Wainwrights had, and had accumulated the kind of casual local influence that came from spending money in the right saloons and knowing the right men. Lewis found out about the incident the following day through the ordinary means by which news traveled in small communities, overheard conversation at the livery. He found Lavinia at the general store in the afternoon and fell into step beside her as she walked toward her wagon. "I heard about Hatch's cattle," he said. She kept walking. "I am handling it." "I know you are. I'm not here to tell you how." He kept pace with her easily. "I wanted to tell you that Elias Dodd has had 2 run-ins with Hatch over property lines, and he prevailed both times by going to the county surveyor rather than the clerk." The surveyor's records carry more weight in cattle disputes because they're tied to federal land patents. That's worth knowing. She stopped and looked at him. The afternoon sun was direct and she had to shade her eyes with her hand to look up at him, which meant he had a clear view of her face when the hardness around her eyes softened slightly. "That is actually useful information," she said. "I know, that's why I told you." She almost smiled. "You are not what I expected when I first saw you." "What did you expect?" She considered the question with the seriousness she brought to everything. Another man who would get in the way while thinking he was helping. And instead you handed me information and stepped out of the way, she said. "That is considerably rarer." He did step out of the way after that, deliberately, while also remaining present in the peripheral way he had mastered. He went with her, at her invitation, to the county surveyor's office, where he provided testimony about the fence line and the property boundaries as someone who had surveyed the Dodd land and was familiar with the adjacent terrain. The surveyor took the matter seriously. Porter Hatch was assessed damages and required to maintain his fence line or face a fine. When they rode back from the county office, side by side on the road between Caldwell and their respective properties, the evening was cooling into the particular golden lavender beauty that the Kansas plains could produce in September when they chose to. Lavinia rode with her hat pushed back and her face turned slightly upward as if she was taking inventory of the sky. "My father wanted to build something here," she said, not specifically to Lewis but not only to herself either. "He came out from Ohio in 1861 before everything got difficult. He had plans for a proper house, a full orchard, more acreage. My mother was alive then." She paused. "She died when I was 6. And after that it was just the two of us and the plans got smaller. Not because he gave up, but because there was only so much he could do." "How much of the original plan is still there?" Lewis asked. She looked at him, surprised by the question. Most people responded to that kind of statement with condolence. He had responded with inquiry, which was different. "The house frames are still in the ground where he planned a second structure. He wanted a proper barn rather than the shed we have. He wanted an orchard starting at the southwest corner." She paused again. "I have thought about trying to begin the orchard. The soil is right for apple trees in that corner. But one person cannot dig the planting holes and manage everything else simultaneously." "No," he agreed. "One person cannot." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a conversation that was not finished but was content to wait. In October, Theodore had his worst episode yet. Lavinia found him on the porch unable to stand, his face ashen, his breathing shallow and uneven. She got him inside and sent the neighboring boy, a 12-year-old named Cal who sometimes did chores in exchange for food, riding hard to Caldwell for the doctor. While she waited, she sat beside her father's bed and held his hand and talked to him in a low, steady voice about ordinary things. The state of the corn harvest, the way the light had looked on the field that morning, the new litter of kittens that one of the barn cats had produced behind the hay bales. She talked so he would have something to anchor himself to, and she kept her voice from shaking by a will that cost her considerably. The doctor arrived in the early evening. He examined Theodore and spoke to Lavinia in the kitchen afterward in a tone that was both professional and genuinely sympathetic. "He needs to stop working entirely," the doctor said. "And I mean entirely. He has the constitution of an ox, but his heart is not keeping pace. Complete rest, warmth through the winter, and no more physical exertion. If he follows that regimen, there is every reason to think he will have several more good years. If he doesn't follow it, I cannot make you any promises." Lavinia thanked the doctor, saw him out, and then stood at the kitchen window in the dark for a long while looking at the yard. She was calculating, which was what she did when she was frightened. She was calculating how much needed to be done before winter, how much she could do alone, what could be let go and what could not. The winter wheat needed to go in. The root vegetables needed to come up and be stored. The roof of the shed had a soft spot that would not survive serious snow. The fence on the north side had been patched 4 times and really needed to be replaced. She could do perhaps 2/3 of this before the first hard frost. The other third would have to wait for spring, and some things that had to wait for spring might not be survivable by whatever was waiting for them. She went to bed and slept 5 hours and rose before dawn. Lewis noticed the change in her when she came into Caldwell that week. It was a subtle change. She carried herself the same way, spoke the same way, managed her errands with the same efficient manner, but something around her eyes was different, more contained, as if she had put a lid on something that needed more room than the container allowed. He did not ask about it in town. He rode out to the Wainwright property that Sunday afternoon with no particular pretext and simply found her in the yard, splitting wood with a focus that suggested she had been at it for some time. She looked up and stopped. "I heard about your father's episode," he said from the fence gate. "I'm sorry, how is he?" "Better. He is irritating the doctor by trying to sit up." A small, pained smile. "He is not a man who accepts limitation gracefully." "Neither are you," Lewis said. He said it gently, not as a criticism. She set the axe down. "You came all the way out here on a Sunday to tell me that." "I came because I thought you might want some help with whatever is most urgent before the frost," he said. "And because I have Sunday afternoons free, and I find that I would rather spend them doing something useful than sitting in the bunkhouse at Dodd's place listening to the hands play cards." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was at his back, and he was standing there in his canvas work jacket and his worn hat and his honest, steady face, and she felt something shift in her chest in a way that was almost alarming. "The roof of the shed," she said finally. "That is the most urgent." "Show me," he said. He spent that Sunday afternoon on the shed roof, replacing the soft boards with lumber from a stack Theodore had been saving for 2 years, while Lavinia worked below cutting and passing up pieces at the right lengths. They worked efficiently together in a way that neither of them commented on, but both of them noticed. There was a rhythm to it. He anticipated what she was about to hand him. She anticipated what length he was going to need next. They talked while they worked, not about anything particularly important. He told her about a foolish cattle drive he had been on in 1875 where a river crossing had gone wrong, and they had lost 40 head. She told him about the summer she was 13 when she had read every book on the lending shelf twice over, and had written to a library in Ohio asking if they could send her something she had not already read. And they had actually done it, 3 novels in a crate, which had arrived in such an unlikely fashion that she had stood in the yard, holding them for several minutes before she could make herself go inside. "What were the books?" he asked. She smiled. 2 of them were dull. One of them was extraordinary, George Eliot. "I've read George Eliot," he said, which made her look up at him with the particular expression of someone who has received unexpected information. "You have?" "My mother had a copy of Middlemarch. I read it 3 times when I was laid up with a broken leg one winter. I had nothing else to do." "What did you think of it?" He considered the question with the same seriousness with which she had answered his earlier questions. "I thought it was the most honest book I'd ever read about people wanting things they couldn't have and settling for what was available to them," he said. "And how that settling sometimes turns out to be neither as bad nor as good as you feared." She was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was about how the world is built too small for most of the people in it." He looked at her from his position on the roof. "Maybe it's both," he said. She handed him the next board. By the time they finished, the shed roof was sound and the light had gone the deep orange of late October afternoon. Theodore was awake inside and called out when he heard boots on the porch, and Lavinia brought Lewis in to meet him. Theodore Wainwright looked at Lewis with the particular assessment of a man who has spent his life reading weather and land and livestock, and had developed a general facility for reading people as well. He shook Lewis's hand from his chair and asked him where he was from and what he had done and whether he had family, and Lewis answered all of it directly and without performance, and Theodore sat with those answers for a while. "You fixed my roof," Theodore said. "Yes, sir. My daughter asked you to." "Your daughter showed me what needed doing and we worked on it together," Lewis said. She did more than half of it. Theodore looked at Lavinia, who was standing in the doorway to the kitchen with her arms loosely crossed, and something passed between father and daughter that did not require words. Theodore had been watching his daughter carry this weight for months, had been doing the painful arithmetic of what she could and could not manage alone, and had been, in the private hours of his illness, afraid for her in a way he had no adequate vocabulary for. Not afraid that she would fail. He knew she would not fail. He was afraid that she would succeed entirely alone, and that the cost of that solitary success would be something she gave without ever quite naming it. He looked back at Lewis Brenner, and the lines of his face settled into something that was not approval exactly, but was the precursor to it. "Have you eaten?" Theodore asked. Lewis stayed for supper. The evenings that followed, not every night but with increasing frequency through November, had the quality of something being built without a formal plan. Lewis would ride over after his work at the Dodd Ranch was done, and they would work on whatever was most pressing on the Wainwright property. And then they would eat supper together, the three of them, and talk. Theodore, who had been educated to a degree uncommon for farming men of his generation, had opinions about everything from the cattle trade to the railroad politics that were reshaping the West to the question of what Kansas should do about its role in the ongoing conflict between cattlemen and farmers. Lewis engaged with all of it earnestly. He was not a man who talked to older people out of politeness while waiting for the conversation to end. He was genuinely curious. And Lavinia watched this, and felt the warmth in her chest growing in a way that she was beginning to find impossible to categorize as anything other than what it was. She had not, in her 24 years, had occasion to fall in love. There had been a boy in Caldwell when she was 17 who had paid attention to her for a summer, but his attention had been of the kind that wanted her softened and simplified, and she had not been able to manage softening or simplifying herself even when she tried. There had been other men here and there who had shown interest in the farm as much as in her, which she had recognized with a clarity that was not cynicism but realism. She had resigned herself, not entirely with peace, to a life in which she was most fully herself at the expense of being wanted. Lewis Brenner wanted her, she was beginning to understand, specifically because she was most fully herself. And that was so foreign to her experience that she could not quite absorb it all at once. It came to her in pieces, the way cold comes to you when you've been working hard. You don't feel it until you stop moving. She stopped moving one evening in early November when they were alone in the barn doing the evening feeding, Theodore having gone to bed early after a long day, and Lewis was measuring out feed while she checked the condition of the hay, and he said, completely out of the context of what they had been discussing, which was the viability of adding a second milk cow to the operation, "I want to say something." She stopped and looked at him. He set down the feed bucket and turned to face her directly, which was characteristic of him. He was not a man who addressed you from a sideways angle. "I want to say that I am aware that I have been here a great deal over the past month, and I want to be clear about why." She waited. "It is not only because the work needs doing," he said. "It is because of you." He said it simply, without decoration, and the simplicity of it made it more substantial rather than less. "I am aware that this is not the time to be saying something like this, with your father ill and the farm demanding everything you have, and I am not asking anything of you. I am only being honest because I think you deserve honesty and because I would rather you know and have the opportunity to tell me to stop coming around than for you to not know and for there to be a misunderstanding between us." The barn was quiet. One of the horses shifted in its stall. The lantern light moved slightly. "Lewis," she said. "Yes. I am not going to tell you to stop coming around." He looked at her steadily. "All right. But I need you to understand something." She spoke carefully, because she had been thinking about this without knowing she had been thinking about it. "I cannot be a woman who puts something down and picks up something else. This farm, my father, the plans he started, I cannot walk away from any of it. Whoever I am that too, all of it together." "I know that," he said. "I don't want you any other way." She believed him. That was the thing. She looked at him and she believed him, and that believing was like something unlocking in her that she had not known was locked. She did not kiss him in the barn. She was not quite ready for that, and he, characteristically, did not push for it. But she put her hand out, and he took it, and they stood there for a moment in the lamplight with the horses and the hay and the smell of autumn coming through the gap under the barn door. And it was, she thought afterward, one of the most significant moments of her life despite being one of the quietest. November brought the first hard frost and then, a week later, snow. Lavinia had the root vegetables stored and the winter wheat in the ground and 3 cords of wood stacked on the porch. And when she surveyed the property in the gray morning after the first snowfall, she felt, for the first time in months, that the winter might be survivable. Not comfortable. She did not have the luxury of comfortable, but survivable. Lewis had made himself indispensable to the Wainwright operation in a way that was now acknowledged between all 3 of them, which is to say that Theodore had begun directing Lewis as well as Lavinia on the days when he was well enough to sit up and give instructions, and Lewis had taken to this without any indication that being directed by an ill man in a chair represented a diminishment of any kind. He understood implicitly that Theodore's knowledge was worth more than his own physical capacity, and he honored that, and Theodore saw that he honored it. One evening in late November, Theodore asked Lewis to sit with him while Lavinia was in the kitchen, and he said in his direct, unsentimental way, "You care for my daughter." "Yes, sir," Lewis said, "I do." "She doesn't make it easy," Theodore said. "No, sir, she makes it worth it." Theodore looked at him for a long time. "I have spent 30 years trying to build something for her that would be enough," he said quietly. "I never quite managed to build it big enough. The land is good, but it is one man's reach. She has always needed more room than I could give her." He paused. "I don't say that to put the burden on you. I say it so you understand what you would be getting into." "I understand it," Lewis said. "She is the finest person I have ever known," Theodore said, "including her mother, and I loved her mother with everything I had. But Lavinia has something her mother didn't have, a kind of clarity. She sees things all the way through. That can be difficult to live alongside because she will see you all the way through too." "I know that," Lewis said. "I'm counting on it." Theodore was quiet for a moment, and then he said in a different tone, "Well, I suppose we had better figure out what to do with the southwest corner in the spring." Lewis understood that this was not a change of subject. December was cold and quiet in the way that Kansas winters could be cold and quiet, pressing down on the land with a gray, snow-muffled patience that encouraged contemplation. Lewis continued to ride over to the Wainwright property several times a week, and on the evenings when the snow was too heavy for easy travel, he spent those evenings at Dodd's bunkhouse, thinking about what he was doing with his life in a way that he had not thought about it in years. He had been, for the decade of his 20s, a man in motion. Not because he was running from anything specific, but because motion had felt like the natural mode of a young man in a Western territory where the land itself was still being defined. He had done what the land and the time required: ridden, worked, moved on. He had accumulated skills and experience and not much else, which had seemed like a reasonable exchange. Now, at 30, he found himself wanting to stop moving. Not out of exhaustion, but out of desire, the positive, forward-facing desire for something that had a shape and a name and a specific location on the Kansas plains. He wanted to stay. He wanted to build something. He wanted to build it alongside Lavinia Wainwright. He thought about what Theodore had said, one man's reach. He thought about the empty house frames in the ground on the southwest side of the property, the orchard she had described, the plans that had gotten smaller over 30 years. He thought about what those plans might look like if there were 2 people making them instead of 1. He talked to Elias Dodd in December about his situation, not asking permission but explaining, because Dodd had been good to him and deserved honest dealing. Dodd was a practical man who understood the West and its logic, and he received the news that Lewis was considering a more permanent arrangement on the neighboring property with the equanimity of a man who had expected something like this eventually. I will need a foreman, Dodd said. I can recommend 2 men who would do the job well, Lewis said, and I'm happy to help with the transition. You planning to buy in on the Wainwright land? I am planning to ask Miss Wainwright what she wants, Lewis said. I think starting there is probably the right sequence. Dodd laughed, which was something he did rarely. You're a smarter man than most, he said. Christmas that year came in on the back of a blizzard that kept everyone indoors for 3 days. And on the 4th day, when the sky cleared into the brilliant piercing blue that follows Kansas blizzards, Lavinia went outside and stood in the snow-covered yard in the cold sunlight and felt, in a way that she could not entirely explain, happy. Genuinely, uncomplicated happy, which was not a state she had extensive experience with and which she therefore stood in the middle of for a moment, taking careful inventory of it. Her father was better. He had managed December without a serious episode, and the doctor on his last visit had said that the rest had made a genuine difference and that Theodore's color was improved. The farm had come through the early winter intact. The winter wheat was sleeping under 6 inches of snow, waiting. And Lewis was coming over that afternoon to have Christmas dinner with them, which Theodore had suggested and Lavinia had arranged. And when she thought about him riding up the snow-covered lane in the afternoon light, she felt that warmth in her chest that she had stopped trying to categorize and had simply allowed to be what it was. She went inside and cooked the best dinner she could manage with what they had, which was considerable because she was a very good cook when she had the time for it, and she had put back enough to make Christmas feel like Christmas. Theodore sat at the table in his best shirt and told her the meal smelled like the first good thing that had happened to him in months, and she laughed and told him he was being dramatic, and he said he was not being dramatic, he was being accurate, which was a distinction he had always maintained. Lewis arrived in the mid-afternoon with a bottle of rye whiskey for Theodore and a book for Lavinia. She unwrapped it carefully and found it was a volume of essays and agricultural science that included, among other things, the most current thinking on fruit tree cultivation in the American Midwest. She looked up at him with the book in her hands. "For the orchard," he said, "whenever you are ready for it." She did not say anything for a moment, and then she said, "Thank you," and the weight she put into those 2 words was sufficient to carry everything else she meant by them. They ate dinner and Theodore had 1 glass of rye whiskey and declared it the finest Christmas in recent memory, which, coming from a man who had spent the previous months fighting his own body for the right to stay alive, carried a weight that made both Lewis and Lavinia go quiet for a moment with something that was not sadness, but its near neighbor. The awareness of how close to the edge things had been, and how much they valued being on the right side of it. After dinner, Theodore excused himself to rest and they sat by the fire together, Lavinia with the agricultural book in her lap and Lewis with his long legs stretched toward the fire, and they talked for a long time about the orchard and what an expanded property might look like, and how the operation could be changed to be more sustainable with less physical cost to whoever was running it. They talked about it the way people who are building something together talk about it, practically, ambitiously, with the easy back and forth of 2 people whose ideas fit together without one having to shrink itself to make room for the other. At some point, the talking slowed and the fire settled and the house was very quiet, and Lavinia became aware that Lewis was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was not the direct, measured look he usually wore. It was something softer and more unguarded, the same quality she had noticed in his smile on that first meeting at the Dodd Ranch, but deeper now, grown over months into something that had weight and permanence to it. "I want to ask you something," he said. Her pulse moved differently. "Not yet," he added quickly, and she understood him, not a formal question, not tonight, but something building toward it. "I want to ask you something that comes before that." He paused. "I want to know if you want me to stay, not just for the winter, not as a help with the farm. I want to know if you want me to stay the way I mean it, which is as a permanent thing." She looked at him in the firelight. She had known this was coming in the way you know a storm is coming, not the exact hour but the direction, the character of the air. She had been preparing herself for it not by armoring against it but by opening toward it, which was something she had never done before and which had required a conscious and daily act of trust. "Yes," she said, "I want you to stay." He reached over and took her hand, and this time he brought it to his lips briefly, and the gesture was so formal and so sincere at the same time that she felt it move through her like a current. "Good," he said. "Then I am staying." January arrived with the particular iron seriousness of a Kansas winter that meant business. Lewis had begun the formal transition from the Dodd Ranch, helping to train a new foreman over a period of 3 weeks, and in the gaps, he spent his time at the Wainwright property with an investment that was now openly acknowledged as something different from charity or neighborly assistance. He and Lavinia worked out, in the practical way they did everything, what an arrangement between them would look like on the property, and the conversation had a quality of building rather than bargaining because neither of them came to it with the desire to take from the other. Lewis had some money saved from his years of work, not a great deal, but enough to make a real contribution. He proposed putting it toward the materials for the second structure that Theodore had planned, which would function as an expanded barn and storage, and then in the spring beginning the orchard. Lavinia listened to this with the serious attention she gave everything and then said, "That money is yours." "I am not comfortable with it becoming the farm's before we have," and she paused and a faint color came into her face. "Before we have made it official," Lewis said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Then let's make it official." She looked back at him. The kitchen was cold and the fire in the stove was doing its best, and outside the window the January landscape was white and flat and still. She was 24 years old and she had been alone in her responsibilities for so long that the idea of not being alone had the quality of something almost disorienting, like stepping off a boat onto solid ground after a long crossing. She needed a moment to find her balance. "Lewis," she said. "Yes, I have never been someone who does things the traditional way," she said. "I want you to know that before you ask, because I think you should know who you are asking." "I know who I am asking," he said. "I am asking Lavinia Wainwright, who fixed her own well pump using an almanac and arguments she won with county surveyors, and does not like being helped unless the help is actually useful." He paused, and the seriousness in his face gave way to that smile that had changed his whole expression back in September. "Who reads George Eliot and wants an apple orchard, and has been carrying a weight too large for one person long enough that someone ought to offer to carry it alongside her?" Her eyes were bright. She would not have described what she felt as simply happiness because it was too large for that word. It was more like the sense of a thing becoming complete. "Ask me then," she said softly. He came and stood before her, not on one knee, that was not the style of either of them and they both knew it, but close, facing her, his hands taking hers in that careful way he had. "Lavinia, will you marry me?" She looked at him. This man who had appeared in her life at the moment when her life was at its most difficult and had not tried to rescue her from it but had simply stood beside it and by extension beside her, who had read George Eliot and fixed shed roofs, and treated her father's knowledge with the respect it deserved, and told her the truth in the straightforward way she required. And she said, "Yes." He pulled her toward him and she went, and when he kissed her it was with the same quality that characterized everything he did. Fully present, entirely sincere, without reservation. Theodore Wainwright, when they told him, sat very still for a moment and then pressed his lips together in a way that Lavinia recognized as her father's version of being overcome, and then he said, "Well, I suppose we are going to need to fix that east fence line before spring after all." They were married in February in the small church in Caldwell, on a day so cold that the breath of the wedding guests was visible inside the building, and the minister wore his coat over his vestments. Lavinia wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that matched her eyes, and she carried a spray of dried wildflowers that she had preserved from the previous summer's field, because there was nothing fresh to be had in February in Kansas. And she stood next to Lewis Brenner in front of 20-odd people, and married him with a steady voice and a hand that did not tremble. Lewis wore his best clothes, which were clean and well kept and honest in the way everything about him was honest. He said his vows with the same directness with which he said everything, looking at her the entire time, and when the minister said he could kiss his bride, he did so gently and briefly because there were people watching and he was, at his core, a private man, and Lavinia was privately grateful for that particular restraint. Elias Dodd came to the wedding and shook Lewis's hand afterward with the gruff warmth of a man who does not frequently express warmth, but makes it unmistakable when he does. Several of the townspeople came who knew Lavinia from her years of twice-weekly marketing trips, and she was surprised by how many of them she had come to know in ways that felt, on this particular day, like genuine affection. The dry goods merchant who always had the feed almanac set aside for her, the doctor who had been kind to her about Theodore, the surveyor who had taken her complaint about Porter Hatch seriously. They were not her community in any formal sense, but they were, she realized, a community she had built over years of showing up and doing honest business and asking for what she needed without pretense. They went home to the Wainwright farm, the three of them, which was how it would be for the foreseeable future, and this suited everyone. Theodore required the care, and Lewis had no other home to go to, and Lavinia would not have left her father for any reason that could have been presented to her. They arranged the house sensibly, as sensible people do, and Lewis moved his 2 saddlebags of possessions in and hung his hat on the peg by the door, and the house shifted, in that subtle way that houses do, to include him. Spring came to Kansas with its customary disregard for anything that had been difficult about the winter before it. The snow retreated and the earth softened, and the winter wheat began to show green in the field, and on the morning that Lavinia stood at the southwest corner of the property and looked at the ground that had been waiting for an orchard for 30 years, Lewis was standing beside her with a shovel and the agricultural book she had received at Christmas open to the page on apple tree spacing. "We need to start them in holes 2 feet deep and 18 inches across," she said. "We have the lumber for 9 trees this season," he said. "We can expand in subsequent years." She looked at the corner. She had been looking at it her whole life, seeing it as the place where her father's plans had run out of capacity. She looked at it now and saw what it would be. Row on row of trees, small now and growing slowly into something that would outlast both her and Lewis, something that would be here after them. That was the nature of an orchard. You planted it not only for yourself but for whoever came after. She picked up a shovel. They planted 9 apple trees that spring, working together over the course of 3 weekends, while the rest of the farm's spring work proceeded around them. Theodore sat in a chair they had carried out to the edge of the planting area and supervised from his position, which he did with great enthusiasm and occasional imperious redirection. And Lewis took all of it with good humor, and Lavinia laughed at him more than she had laughed at anyone in her life. "You are enjoying this far too much," Lewis said to Theodore on the second weekend, when Theodore had suggested for the 4th time that the angle of a particular hole was wrong. "I am a man who has been told not to exert himself," Theodore said. "Directing other people exert themselves is the closest available alternative." "He has always been like this," Lavinia said from behind the wheelbarrow. "When I was 12 and he was teaching me to mend fence, he stood at the end of the field and made corrections from 50 yards away." "Did you learn faster for it?" Lewis asked. "I learned faster to avoid telling him I was mending fence," she said. Lewis laughed and Theodore laughed, and the orchard corner was full of the sound of it in the spring light. By May, the orchard was planted and the extended barn structure was framed. Lewis had proven to be an excellent builder in the pragmatic, adaptive way of men who had done many things in many places, and could bring practical knowledge from each of them to bear on whatever was in front of them. He had also, in the quiet months since the wedding, begun establishing a small cattle operation on the Wainwright property, modest in scale but thoughtfully done, using his savings to acquire a starter herd of 6 cows and a bull from a rancher who was downsizing. Lavinia watched the property transform with a feeling she had no simple name for. It was not only satisfaction, though there was satisfaction in it. It was something more like the experience of watching a story. She had always known the shape of finally get written down in the physical world. The things her father had planned and not been able to build, the things she had kept alive in the back of her mind as possibilities she might never reach, were materializing in the spring light of 1879, and she was building them alongside the man she had married 4 months ago, and found that marriage, to the right person, was the most practical and the most profoundly impractical thing in the world simultaneously. She told Lewis this one evening in May as they sat on the front porch, the day's work done and the evening cool and soft after a warm day. He was mending a bridle and she had the account book in her lap but had stopped looking at it. He glanced at her with his particular sideways attention. Which part is practical and which part is impractical? The practical part is everything visible, she said. The barn, the orchard, the cattle. The impractical part is how different it feels to be doing those things than to be doing them alone. He set the bridle down. Is the impractical part good or bad? It is thoroughly good, she said. That is what I cannot quite adjust to. I spent a long time assuming that the impractical feelings were the ones that cost you something, that wanting more than the farm, wanting company, wanting, she paused, that all of those wants were debts, things you paid for in diminishment of some kind, and it turns out they are not debts, they are just more of the same thing, more of what is good. He reached over and took her hand, which by now was as natural a gesture as breathing. You spent a long time doing without them, he said. It makes sense that it takes some adjusting. Were you ever lonely, she asked, in all those years of moving around? He considered this. Not lonely the way you mean, I am comfortable alone. But there is a difference, he said slowly, between being comfortable alone and being complete. I did not feel incomplete until I had something to compare it to. She understood exactly what he meant. In June, Lavinia realized she was pregnant. She told Lewis on a warm evening in the kitchen, directly, in the way she did everything, watching his face carefully. What she saw there was something she had not entirely anticipated. A vulnerability, a large, full openness that his usual measured quality had not prepared her for. He looked at her for a moment, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her in a way that was not his usual careful gentleness but something stronger, something that communicated itself as, "This is the best thing and I am not ready for it and I am grateful beyond the reach of my vocabulary." She held him back and felt his breath slow against her hair. "Are you well?" he asked, when he had composed himself enough to ask things. "I am very well," she said. "The doctor can confirm it when I see him, but I know my own body well enough." He pulled back and looked at her face with that complete attention. "Tell me what you need." "I need everything to continue as it has been," she said. "I am not an invalid. I will work as long as I can work, and when I cannot, I will not." "I know that," he said. "I won't attempt to put you in a chair." "Good," she said, "because I would not stay in it." Theodore received the news the following morning at breakfast. He sat with it for a moment, this man who had spent 30 years trying to build a world large enough for his daughter, and something in his face did a complicated thing that neither Lewis nor Lavinia tried to interpret for him. Then he put his hand flat on the table and said, "I will live to see that child grown," with such certainty that it sounded less like a hope and more like an instruction to his own body. The doctor confirmed Lavinia's pregnancy and declared her health excellent. The summer of 1879 proceeded with the quality of a season that is hard and full and good in equal measure. The farm was growing in a direction, and at a pace that felt, for the first time, like something sustainable rather than something she was constantly rescuing from the edge of failure. Lewis had an instinct for the rhythm of the work that matched hers and in some ways extended it, because he could see things from angles she had not considered, and she could see things he had not noticed. And between them the property lost the embattled quality it had worn for as long as she could remember. The cattle operation progressed. 6 cows had become 9 by July, and the small herd was healthy, and the grass was good after the rains of late spring. Lewis proved to have an understanding of cattle that went beyond the practical to the genuinely skilled, and he began, cautiously, to plan for the following year's expansion. Lavinia watched him work the cattle with the same focus with which she applied herself to everything, and felt the same warm, assured recognition she always felt watching him. Here is a person who is fully in their element. Porter Hatch made one final attempt to encroach on the Wainwright property line in August, this time with a group of his men who rode the fence line at the north edge of the property, at an hour they clearly expected would find it unattended. They found Lewis instead, who had been on his way back from checking the cattle and had seen them from the ridge. He rode down with the quiet, unhurried manner he brought to most things, and he spoke to Hatch's men in a tone that was not threatening but was unambiguously clear. The fence line was documented, the property was his and his wife's, and the next encroachment would be reported to the marshal with a full accounting of the previous incidents. There was a moment's standoff, the kind that the West produced frequently in that period, and then Hatch's men rode away without further event. Lewis rode home and told Lavinia, and she looked at him with appreciation that she expressed not in sentiment but in action, which was also her way. She went out the following morning and walked the full fence line herself, making notes on what needed reinforcing, and they spent the following Saturday making it the most secure it had been in years. Porter Hatch did not trouble them again. By October, Lavinia was visibly pregnant and had made adjustments to the physical demands of the work accordingly, not by stopping but by choosing. She was the kind of woman who made choices rather than accepting the ones offered to her, and this extended to her pregnancy, which she managed with the same practical intelligence she brought to every other challenge. The farm work went on. Lewis was beside her. Theodore, in the extraordinary way he had announced he intended, did not have a single serious episode through the summer and fall, and by October his color was better than it had been in 2 years, and he had graduated from the chair to a slow walk around the yard each morning, and a more active role in the daily direction of the farm. The baby arrived in December, 1 year after the Christmas dinner that had been one of the first occasions on which Lavinia had allowed herself to acknowledge what Lewis was to her. It was a hard night, and the doctor was there, and Lewis was there, and it was the longest night of Lewis Brenner's life in a way that had nothing to do with ours. When it was over and the doctor placed a squalling, red-faced, vehemently alive boy in Lewis's arms, he stood in the lamplight of the bedroom and looked down at this small, enormous person, and felt something happen in him that no amount of miles ridden or years of motion had prepared him for. Lavinia was exhausted and luminous. She reached up from the pillows. He put the baby in her arms. "He is loud," she said. "Extremely loud," Lewis agreed. "He sounds like his grandfather." Theodore, who had been waiting in the kitchen and who was allowed in shortly after, stood over the cradle and looked at this child with the same expression he had worn when Lewis and Lavinia had told him about the baby. That complicated, full, barely contained thing that required no translation for anyone who had ever loved someone. They named the boy Thomas, for reasons that were partly traditional and partly because it was a name that suited him when they considered it, a solid name that would hold up. Thomas Theodore Brenner, with Theodore for reasons that did not need to be explained. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the best winter the Wainwright farm, the Brenner farm now, though they kept both names on it in a compromise that reflected the truth of what it was, had seen in a decade. Thomas was a sturdy, opinionated baby who had his mother's blue eyes and his father's thoughtful expression, and a voice that suggested he had opinions about everything even before he had words for any of them. Lewis woke in the night for feedings with the same full presence he brought to everything, which meant Lavinia did not carry that alone either, and she looked at him across the baby in the lamplight of those night hours with a love that had grown so large and so practiced by now that it had stopped startling her, and had simply become the landscape she lived in. Spring of 1880 came. The orchard trees, now in their second year, were growing. Small and slender still, they would not bear fruit for several years, but they were alive and increasing, and Lewis checked them each morning with the attention you give something you are invested in for the long term. Lavinia sometimes went with him, and they walked the orchard rows with Thomas on Lewis's hip, and she thought about what he had said in the kitchen in January of the previous year about the difference between being comfortable alone and being complete. She thought about her father's plans, the ones that had gotten smaller over the years, and she understood now that plans do not get small because people are insufficient. They get small because some things require more than one pair of hands. They require two people who see the same shape in the future and are willing to build toward it together. Theodore had his good years, as the doctor had said he would. He was present for Thomas's first steps, which happened on a warm April afternoon in the kitchen, and he sat in his chair and watched his grandson walk with an expression of such unguarded delight that it made Lavinia have to turn away and compose herself before she could trust her face again. He taught Thomas to identify birds before Thomas had words for bird, pointing and naming, and Thomas pointed back with a serious attention that was entirely his mother. Lewis and Theodore had, in the year since the wedding, become something that had its own logic and warmth. They were not father and son exactly, because the relationship was too much between equals for that, but it had the depth of something built on genuine mutual respect and the gradual accumulation of shared experience. Lewis had come to value Theodore's knowledge in the way that a man who has been largely self-taught values a teacher, enormously, and with a kind of gratitude that is not subservience but something more collegial. Theodore, who had spent 30 years missing the person he most wanted to talk to, his wife, who had been gone since Lavinia was 6, had found in Lewis someone who would argue with him and listen to him in equal measure, and he was, in the private reckoning of his own heart, more glad than he could say. The summer of 1880 brought more growth. Lewis had expanded the cattle herd to 20, which was the number he had identified as the proper scale for the land and the labor available. Lavinia had put a second crop of winter wheat in, with a technique she had modified from the agricultural book, and the yield in the spring had been noticeably better. The extended barn was fully completed and in use. The property, which had for years carried the look of a place perpetually behind on its own maintenance, had found its footing and then some. Lavinia rode into Caldwell on the August market day with Thomas on her hip and a wagon full of produce and eggs, and she did the rounds of the merchants with the same efficiency she had always brought to the task, except that now the task was larger, and the circumstances were different, and she herself was different in the specific way of a person whose life has opened up in a direction they had not fully believed it would. She ran into the doctor outside the general store, and he asked after Theodore, and she told him that her father was well, genuinely well, and that he had beaten the odds of the previous 2 years, and seemed inclined to keep doing so. The doctor shook his head with the particular admiration of a man who has prescribed things he was not entirely sure would work and seen them work anyway. "There is sometimes a factor that is not medical," he said. "Your father has something to stay for." She looked down at Thomas, who was examining the brass button on the doctor's coat with complete fascination. "Yes," she said, "he does." She drove home in the late afternoon with the wagon lighter and the receipts in her pocket, and when she came up the lane she could see Lewis at the fence line on the west side, working with the easy, self-contained competence that was his characteristic mode, and she pulled the wagon to a stop for a moment and watched him from the lane. He had not seen her yet. He was entirely himself, undirected by any external attention, and the sight of him was both familiar and still capable of producing in her the same warmth it had produced on that November evening in the barn when he had told her the truth, and she had told him she was not going to ask him to leave. She had not said yes to any of it yet that evening. She had said she was not going to tell him to stop coming around. She had said the words were not right. She had carried the weight of the farm and her father and the plans that had gotten small with the years, and she had been building everything one piece at a time long before Lewis Brenner arrived in her life, and all of that was still true. But there was a version of building that was different from survival. There was a version that was more than the sum of what you were trying to keep from falling. Lewis had not saved her from anything. She had not been in need of saving. He had simply appeared at the moment when building alone had reached the limit of what was possible, and he had stood beside her and said, "Here is where I would like to be if you will have me." And she had said yes, not to helplessness, not to rescue, to partnership, which was something else entirely. She drove the wagon up the lane. He looked up from the fence line and raised a hand. She raised hers back. Thomas made a sound of recognition and reached toward his father with both arms, and Lewis set down the fence tool and came toward the wagon, and the evening light was that October gold quality that Lewis had once noted was the most beautiful thing about the Kansas plains when they chose to be beautiful, and Lavinia thought that she would never exhaust the appreciation she had for this particular sight. These two, the man and the child, moving toward each other in the light of a day that had been ordinary and full and sufficient. By the spring of 1881, the orchard was beginning to show promise. Not fruit yet, apple trees required patience that extended beyond a single season. But the trees had grown substantially in their second year, and Lewis had added 3 more to the original 9, bringing the orchard to 12 trees. And the southwest corner of the property had transformed from the place where Theodore's plans had run out into something that was visibly becoming what it had always been meant to be. Lavinia found herself standing there one afternoon in March, while Lewis was working the cattle and Thomas was asleep in the house under Theodore's supervision. And she looked at the 12 young trees and thought about the library book that had arrived in its crate when she was 13. And the way she had stood in the yard holding it because it was so unlikely and wonderful that she needed a moment before she could trust it. She thought about the months after her father's collapse when she had done the arithmetic of survival every night, and the numbers had never quite come out even. She thought about a man with sandy hair and careful hands catching a falling crate outside the feed store and touching the brim of his hat and saying nothing more than morning. She thought about how a world gets built. It does not get built all at once. It does not appear because you wished for it or deserved it. It gets built the way an orchard grows, slowly in the ground, requiring patience and 2 pairs of hands and the willingness to stay in a place long enough to see what it becomes. She had been trying to build it alone because there was no other choice, and she had not failed, but she had also not been able to complete it. The completion had required something she had not known how to ask for and had not needed to ask for because it had arrived in the form of a man who asked only where she wanted to begin. She heard boots behind her and turned to find Lewis coming up from the cattle pasture, his coat dusty and his hat pushed back, and she smiled at him in the March light with everything she felt and did not try to hide any of it. He came to stand beside her and looked at the orchard. 3 more this season, he said. We will have 15 by fall. My father wanted an orchard of 20, she said. We will have 20 by 1883, Lewis said. She took his hand, the one closest to her. He turned it and held hers properly, the way he always did, as if her hand in his was a thing he held with careful attention. Lewis, she said, yes. I want to tell you something. All right. I have been thinking, she said, about what my father told me once when I was about 15 and complaining that the farm was too small for everything I wanted to think about. He said that the land is only as large as what you do with it. She paused. I thought he meant I should be more content. I think now he meant something different. I think he meant that the size of a life is not a property of the land. It is a property of how you occupy it. Lewis was quiet for a moment, listening in the way he did, not waiting for her to finish so that he could respond, but actually listening. "And how do you occupy yours?" he asked. She looked at the orchard. She looked at the house where her father and her son were in the same room together. She looked at the man beside her. "Fully," she said. "For the first time in my life, fully." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him without reservation, which was also something she had learned and which still, each time, felt like a choice she was glad to have made. They stood there in the cool March light among the young trees and the turned earth, and the farm was alive around them in all its ordinary, demanding, irreplaceable entirety. Theodore did live to see Thomas grown, or at least to see him pass the most vulnerable years of childhood, which turned out to be sufficient. He was 62 when he died, in the spring of 1888, on a morning when the apple trees were blooming for the 5th year in a row, and the orchard had reached its full intended 20 trees. He died in his bed with Lavinia beside him and Lewis in the doorway, and Thomas, who was 8 years old by then, and had his grandfather's stubbornness and his mother's eyes and his father's way of listening, sitting on the edge of the bed holding his hand. Theodore had accomplished what he had set out to do. He had watched his daughter stop carrying the weight of the world alone. He had watched the plans that had gotten small over 30 years get large again. He had sat in a chair at the edge of an orchard that was his idea and watched it grow. He had held a grandchild on the porch in the evenings and named birds until Thomas could name them all himself. He had died as he had lived, in possession of the knowledge that what he had built was good and would continue. Lavinia grieved for him in the way that the children of parents who have done right by them grieve, fully, without guilt, with the complicated gratitude of someone who knows that what they lost was real and complete rather than something unfinished. Lewis let her grieve without trying to fix it, which was the correct thing, and which she knew was the correct thing, and which she loved him for. The summer after Theodore died, Lavinia discovered she was pregnant again, which she announced to Lewis in the kitchen in June with the same directness she had used the first time, watching his face with that same careful attention. What she saw was the same as the first time, that large, open, unguarded thing that his usual composure did not conceal. "Well," he said, "we should add another room." "We should add another room," she agreed. The baby was a girl, born in February of 1889, 11 years after the summer Lavinia had stood in the East Field and watched her father collapse, and understood with terrible clarity how alone they had always been. She was a small, fierce creature with her mother's coloring, and a disposition that announced itself in the first hours as something that would require space and patience, and probably a great deal of arguing, all of which suited her parents perfectly. They named her Clara Ann Brenner, and Thomas, who was 9 and had spent his whole life the only child of 2 people who brought their complete selves to everything they did, received his sister with a seriousness that made Lavinia laugh through the tears she was too tired to prevent. "She is very small," Thomas said, looking at Clara in the cradle. "You are small too," Lewis said. "I find that hard to believe," Thomas said, which was such a Theodore response that both his parents went still for a moment with the fresh, familiar ache of someone they loved who was no longer in the room. By 1890, the Brenner farm was among the most productive in Sumner County. The orchard bore consistent fruit. The cattle operation had grown to a sustainable 60 head. The winter wheat and summer corn yielded reliably. There was a second structure on the property now, the one that had been framed in Lewis's first spring there, and had gone through several iterations of purpose before becoming the combination workshop and storage that they actually needed. The south fence was solid. The north fence was solid. The well that had gone shallow in 1876 had been redug and deepened in 1884, and had been reliable ever since. They were not wealthy in the way that wealth would come to mean in a later century. They were prosperous in the way of people who have built something real on land they know and own and love, who have made careful decisions with what they had, and accumulated over time the results of those careful decisions. Lewis could look over the property from the ridge above the east field and see something he had helped to build with his hands, and the sight of it produced in him a satisfaction that he thought was probably the best feeling available to a person, the feeling of having done a real thing well. Lavinia, at 36, was still entirely herself. She still argued with merchants and read every book she could acquire and had opinions about everything she encountered. She had begun teaching Clara to read at 4, which was slightly early and entirely effective, and she had been known to take Thomas to the county clerk's office on routine errands so that he understood how civil administration worked, because she believed, based on her own experience, that knowing how things worked was as important as any other kind of education. Lewis had gray at his temples now, which had arrived quietly in his mid-30s and suited him, and the lines around his eyes were more pronounced, which also suited him, because they were the lines of a man who had spent a great deal of his life in bright light with a tendency to look at things carefully. He was 42 in 1890, which was not old but was a different kind of not old than 30 had been, and he found that he did not miss 30 at all. 30 had been restless in ways that 40 was not. 40 had Thomas and Clara and Lavinia and 20 apple trees and 60 cattle and a fence line that was as secure as any fence line in Sumner County, and those were not small things. On a Sunday evening in September of 1890, which was warm and golden, and had the particular quality of a day that knows it is the last of its kind before the season turns, Lavinia and Lewis sat on the front porch in the evening the way they had sat on the front porch hundreds of times before. Thomas was somewhere in the lower field doing something he would explain when asked. Clara was asleep inside, having fallen asleep at the table over her picture book, with the conviction of a child who had decided the evening was over and had not waited for the evening's opinion on the matter. The orchard was visible from the porch, 12 years old now and full and heavy with the late fruit that they would harvest next week, and the light in it was the kind of light that made things look as if they had always been exactly this way and would always continue to be. "What are you thinking about?" Lewis asked her. He still asked her this. After 12 years, he still wanted to know what was in her mind, which was one of the several things that made her love him with a completeness she had once not been able to imagine. "I'm thinking about the first year," she said. "When I came to the Dodd Ranch for the water, I had 3 barrels loaded and I drove home, and I did not think anything specific about you except that you were useful in an unusual way." He smiled at this. "That is very romantic. I am getting to the romantic part." She folded her hands in her lap. "I was thinking about how I felt driving home that day, which was something small and warm and inconvenient." She looked at him. "That is how it started. One small, warm, inconvenient thing in my chest, and 12 years later it is not small at all. It is the largest thing I contain." He looked at her with the eyes that were older but the same gray-green, the same steadiness, the same full attention that had been one of the first things she had recognized as different about him. He reached over and put his hand over hers where they were folded in her lap. "I fell in love with you outside the feed store," he said. "When you were arguing about credit and you were absolutely right and completely certain of it, and you did not look at me once while you were doing it. You never told me that. I am telling you now." She turned her hand under his until they were properly laced together. The orchard moved slightly in the evening breeze. Somewhere in the lower field, Thomas shouted something at nobody in particular, which was a habit of his when he was working alone. Clara slept. The farm breathed around them, this living thing they had built together, and the evening light was in the apple trees and the world was the right size. "Lewis," she said. "Yes. I am glad you had quick hands that morning." He brought her hand up and kissed it, this time not briefly, with the full, unhurried tenderness of a man who had been building toward permanence for 12 years and had arrived at it and intended to stay. "So am I," he said. The night came in gently, as September nights do in Kansas when they are at their best, and the stars came out over the plains in the abundant, indifferent, magnificent way they had been coming out over those plains, since long before any human being had made plans for an orchard or argued about credit, or followed a copper-colored horse into a town with a letter of employment and an unexamined hope for something that would be worth staying in one place for. They stayed on the porch a long while, the two of them, while the farm settled into the night around them. Inside, their daughter slept over her picture book. In the field, their son called out to the dark. And the apple trees stood in the dark of the orchard, 20 of them, heavy with the year's fruit, rooted so deeply in the Kansas earth that no wind or drought or passage of time was going to move them. Some things, once planted properly, simply grow.